So a lot of this, and I don't pretend to understand woke engineering, they've actually written a complete textbook, believe it or not, on woke engineering. So I've got to order it just so I can cut it up, because if you don't use facts to design spacecraft, your crew are dead, and that's about it.
Yeah, you see, it's really hard for me to wrap my mind around that kind of approach to engineering. Mm-hmm. Anything else, okay, literature and history being the two big ones, I think it's really easy to understand how you can make those kinds of cases. And in some instances, and this is one of the problems, I think, with the whole woke culture, is that some of what they talk about is somewhat plausible. Mm-hmm. Okay. For
like
instance,
in the soft sciences, yeah.
Yeah, in the soft sciences. I mean, I don't
psychology and anthropology.
As someone whose undergraduate training is in psychology, social psychology, I like to point out to people that it's really not social sciences.
Oh yeah.
It's an interesting field, mm-hmm. but it's not science. Mm-hmm. I mean, not according to what I think is the classical definition of science.
Well, I'm going to have to learn more about it so I can bring it up better in another interview. But, the interesting thing, Nick and Joe, is Helen Pruckrow says that the reason wokeness has taken off is because so much of our modern science, so much of our modern decision-making, the fact that we're supposed to use evidence to make decisions and have rational arguments, that was a philosophy, an approach that was promoted by white male Westerners. And she says, for that reason, it is to be rejected. It doesn't seem to cross her mind that long before the Europeans had gunpowder, for example, the Chinese had it. So were they being dominated by, they were using science as well? And the Indians? I mean, the whole idea that all of this science and all of this decision-based, actually what it is it's really decision-based evidence-making. I almost, I was going to bring that up, but I said it backwards by mistake.
Sorry, what did you say? You said that backwards? Decision-based evidence-making?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what happens in our government today.
Okay, that's what I was just going to say. Like, let's just talk about that for a second. That's actually a really important phrase.
Yeah.
And an important point to make. Because a casual listener to the show might have thought you just said it backwards by accident, right? Yeah. But you didn't really.
Well, I did. I was planning to bring it up in a few minutes, but I said it backwards by accident. And I'll give you an example. One of the scientists that I've worked with, he worked for Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and he studied the North Atlantic, and he found that it was cooling. But the minister, of course, had said the opposite. So, he wrote a paper in which he showed what he showed, and he's an expert on oceans. And they wouldn't publish it. In fact, they wouldn't even forward it to the journal. And so he waited and tried to get a hold of the director. Why won't you publish my paper? Why won't you publish it? And he finally cornered him in the washroom where he couldn't get away. And he kind of patted it up on the shoulder, and he doesn't want me to use his name, so I won't use his name. He said, well, Dr. X, you've had lots of papers published, eh? And he said, yes. He says, well, you wouldn't mind if we just didn't pass this one on. And he said, yes, I would mind. I spent a lot of time on it. He said, well, it actually says something different to what the minister said. And so the only acceptable outcome for his research would be to support the decision that the minister had already made. One of my sisters used to work in a particular government department, and I won't say which one because it would identify my sister, but she was asked to go and find evidence to support what the minister said. And after a while, she came back and said, well, there's no evidence. They said, look harder. So she was the one that told me, she said, well, this is decision-based evidence making. It's not evidence-based decision-making. And I think the same thing happens in COVID. It happens in all kinds of things. I mean, the government wants to justify certain policies in COVID. So the evidence has to be there. And, of course, they inflate it and do all kinds of manipulations so that it supports the government's decision. So that's, unfortunately, what we're seeing is decision-based evidence-making. It's totally dishonest. And the UN does it all the time on climate. And that's something we can get into because, you hear these announcements from the IPCC. Well, of course, they are assigned to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has already made the decision that climate change is caused by humans, it's going to be disastrous, and we have to stop it. So that's the decision. IPCC has to find the evidence. So it's completely corrupt.
So, Tom, tell me, Nick, tell me, how is climate change affecting you in Sioux Lookout?
Well, let's just say we could use a little bit of it. I would really. It's one of those times. This is getting to be the time of year when I really wish guys like David Suzuki, who we'll talk about a little bit later, because he's had a few interesting things to say, and I'm sure Tom wants to weigh in on that because I want to hear what. Anyway, I won't get ahead of myself, but the bottom line is, it's not getting any warmer. Let's put it that way. I've been talking to some of the locals up here. And we got 1.5 feet of snow before the end of end of November, and it's still on the ground. It's still there. And if this is global warming, then somebody's been a little less than honest. Imagine that in that field of study, somebody not being completely honest with us. Anyway, I know it's hard to believe, Tom. I get it.
Yeah, I found something on Leonardo, by the way. It says here, not only did Leonardo write with a special kind of shorthand he invented himself, but he also mirrored his writing, starting at the right side of the page and moving to the left. Only when he was writing something intended for other people did he write in the normal direction. The purpose of his mirror writing is unknown, but one idea is that he did it to keep his hands clean because he was left-handed. And so he didn't want to drag his hand across the writing as he wrote it because it would smudge it. So that's one of the theories as to why he did it. It may also be that he was trying to keep things secret. I don't know. But that may take a little practice to write backwards so you can read it in a mirror.
Well, certain air traffic controllers do that out of habit. When you're vectoring aircraft on an aircraft carrier or things like that, you need to learn how to write backwards because it's a piece of glass you're writing on, and the people you're writing for are on the other side of the glass.
Cool.
So there's a little bit of trivia you didn't know you needed to know.
Yeah, and I was an ex-Air Force guy. I didn't know that.
Well, that's what they used to talk about down in the boiler rooms.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had nothing else to talk about. There was no work to do. Wait a minute. Yes,
it's funny. I'm seeing a repeat. Talking about Air Force and things, I'm seeing a bit of a repeat with this Trudeau as to previous Trudeau and also Chrétien. You might remember Chrétien approved he said that we were going to ratify the Kyoto Protocol in South Africa when he hadn't consulted any of his people. He had no idea how we were going to do it. He just did it. He just said it. And his own advisors were shocked because he hadn't talked to us. Now Trudeau says he's going to do all these great things with respect to great, in quote, things with respect to climate change and the Paris Agreement and everything else. And he's saying they're going to consult this net zero committee. I thought, well, maybe you should have consulted them before you made the decision instead of consulting them after. I mean, again, it's going to be decision-based evidence-making. The committee is going to have to figure out some way to justify what the Prime Minister said. And the reason I say it has a relationship to the Air Force is because when I was in the Air Force, guys, back at the Aerospace Engineering Test Establishment in Cold Lake, Trudeau, that first Trudeau, promised the King of Norway that we would fly F-5 Freedom Fighters out of Norway. But he never bothered to check with his Air Force to see if it was even possible. But he just made the commitment. So I was told, as the guy who was in charge of the engine for the F-5, okay, can we fly F-5s out of Norway? No, we don't have the fuel. They need JP4, and they only have JP5 and JP8, and those are like honey in comparison with JP4. They're highly viscous. They don't atomize to the degree that JP4 does. They can't relight at altitude. So my project for the first year and a half of my time after graduating was to try and make these damn engines work on JP5 and JP8. And we did eventually, but it cost the Canadian taxpayer a fortune because I had to do lots of, changes to the engine, all because the Prime Minister never bothered to consult his Air Force before he made the commitment. So we're seeing deja vu again, eh?
Man, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's probably the same thing terrifying. In the Navy. Same thing in the Navy, I imagine too. Probably they make commitments without consulting you guys.
Well, they did, when the captain wanted to go. When the captain was told we're going to sea, he didn't bother. The only time he consulted us was after the decision. He said, "We're sailing on Monday. We better be ready." But the difference is, it wasn't outside the realm of possibility. This is what steamships do or what warships do.
Yeah.
You don't get a whole lot of notice. But when you're flying an airplane, and this is something I've learned, well, I knew it already, but one of the things that comes home to you in a hurry is airplanes don't have much of a glide path. And if you make a mistake, you're in a heap big trouble. You're in a mountain of trouble because there's no place to land. If you're in Norway, there's a good chance you're over water. And where are you going to put this thing should the engines flame out?
Well, that's exactly it. The flame out. That was the problem. Yeah, we could start it on the ground. We could fly. But if you're in certain parts of the flight envelope and you get a flame out, you could not relight with these viscous fuels. And if you're in a dogfight with a Russian MiG, you better get out of your airplane because you're dead. You know, I mean, one engine in a 2-engine plane is out and you can't get a relight. You know, what we did just, guys, it's kind of interesting. We flew the aircraft throughout the envelope and we tried to relight, because we had one side of the aircraft, because they're two independent fuel systems for the two engines. We had one side with JP4, which is great, it relit every time, and the other side with either JP5 and JP8. And we would cold soak it in Cold Lake before we did it. And when we got to altitude, we'd turn off the engine, you know, the test engine, and try and relight. It was terrible. You just couldn't relight it. So we put in a new modification. We had a higher energy ignition system. And that was something that didn't work either. So we had two other modifications to try. We tried to have a new fuel control unit setting. Didn't work either. Then we finally had to bring in various other changes. And all of them had to be used together, which cost the Canadian taxpayer a fortune. And we finally were able to fulfill Trudeau's promise. But, I mean, if he had just promised something else after checking with us to see what was possible, maybe we could have done it with existing fleet. But thanks to Trudeau, you know, tens of millions of dollars were wasted making an engine so it could run on a fuel it was never designed for. But it was an exciting project. It was a cool project. And for me personally, it was great. You know, they'd say, we want you at a meeting in Ottawa, and they'd fly me to Ottawa on a T-Bird. I'd get out of the airplane, have the meeting, and then fly back. It was sort of an exciting time.
Yeah, those kind of things are fun, but unnecessary.
Yeah.
Like, I imagine that's what the people going to these COP meetings feel like. Oh, goody, look, I'm on the world stage. I get that. Yeah, but we don't really need you there.
We're not going to start COP until after the break, though. We got a couple minutes before the break. We have a couple of minutes before the break, and in fact, 2 minutes is all we need to talk about the speech from the throne, the federal speech from the throne, right? So, what were the three main topics? We're gonna tackle the pandemic. We're going to revive the economy, and we're going to tackle climate change. Those were the three main topics in the throne speech. And, you know, I have to tell you, I've been reading all of the criticism, virtually all of the criticism that I have read has been how uninspiring it was. You know, the Liberals have run out of ideas and that kind of thing. But, you know, I actually thinking to myself, that's actually good. I don't actually
say the same thing.
I don't actually mind that the government of the day has run out of ideas and has delivered an uninspiring throne speech. I don't want them to be inspired with anything.
Yeah.
Because an inspired government is a dangerous government in my mind. So
the fact that they keep missing their climate targets, hooray! You know, they don't hit any of their targets. Great,
right. Please
keep it up.
Yeah, I don't
please,
mind,
sir. Can I have some more?
I don't mind a government that's got no idea what to do next either. But you know what's scary is if they ever do figure anything out, it's not going to be good for us.
Well, that's probably fair. Okay. Bottom of the hour, we're going to take our first break. So we'll be back here on the Nick and Joe Show with guest Tom Harris in a few minutes. Stay tuned. I'm Joe, he's Nick, and sitting across from me in the Think Radio broadcast studio is Tom Harris. The executive director